Welcome to the Take a Mulligan podcast with your hosts, Brian and Kenny Mulligan. We hope to encourage you not to quit and keep going. If you're at that place where you just want to stop and give up, don't. Second chances can happen. Try again and take a mulligan.
Hey, thanks so much for listening or watching with us today. We are so glad you could join with us for our episode today. We are going to dive into leadership. What is it? What does it mean? What experiences have we had in that world? And why does it even matter? Because leadership seems to be a very big topic, a lot of stuff out there, but what's it all about? So, Brian, what do you think was your first introduction to leadership? Where do you think, maybe looking back now as an adult, where do you think you started thinking in terms of, oh, that person's leading me?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's kind of a tough thing to ponder, I think, because I don't really think I understood what leadership really was until I was much older. So yes, I got led early on when I was younger, got exposed to leaders, I guess you can call them, but never really had a good concept of leadership until I was probably maybe in my mid-20s, maybe a little bit later than that when I started kind of diving into what leadership was, and that was the first introduction I had. But as far as going back, I was kind of sitting here trying to ponder that and thinking through, when you're younger, obviously, your parents could be your leaders, your older siblings could be your leaders, teachers could be your leaders, coaches, that kind of thing seems natural. But to understand oh, that person's in charge of me, or, oh, I'm following them. I think probably one of the things that comes to mind is my older brother, Sean. We're only about a year and a half apart, so we spent a lot of time together. And I remember, he and I and our neighborhood friend, we would always hang out together. They were the same age. I was a little bit younger. So for me, I think my introduction was understanding that, oh, I'm just a follower, because we would make plans. Oh, what are we going to do? Where are we going to ride our bikes? What sport are we going to play today? And it was always those guys, because they were older, I guess, kind of took the lead on that. So I kind of recognized it as I guess they're in charge. I guess they're kind of leading me. And, even going back to siblings, all of you older siblings, I guess in some cases was similar of okay, if you're babysitting me or watching me or whatever, it was okay, you're leading me, I guess. So, still kind of interesting, because thinking through into, with teachers and stuff too, I guess was probably the other earlier. And I'd probably say that the bigger one out of that time frame was probably the coaches I had playing basketball and some other sports, was kind of, I guess, what I recognize as leadership, but never had a really good concept of what it really was until I was older.
Okay, that's understandable. I think, for me, it was this same thing with other siblings. Obviously, I looked to my older sister. Our older sister, Patty, was a leader. She would get us together for the carnival that we were going to do in our backyard. She led that, and we just sort of followed along. And then Barry, Barry's 3 years older than I am, so I just naturally followed him. He was the big brother, and you sort of did what he did, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I still do that today. He's still my big brother, and which is pretty cool. But yeah, I don't. Yeah, I'm trying to think, did I ever think of it? I guess when I think of some people, when I'm thinking back to people, I think to teachers. I think to, I remember our high school vocal director, because I was in the choir. I know you were in the choir, right, for 4 years?
No, I never did the choir stuff. No, you guys all did the choirs and the plays and everything. I didn't do any of that. I went the sports route instead.
You could sing.
I sat in too many auditoriums, falling asleep all the time when I was a young kid and watching all you guys do all your stuff. So I guess I decided to go in a different direction.
But I remember him. He was a definite leader. And, as Richard Lopeman was the teacher we had for years, and he directed the plays and all that kind of stuff. And I just admired his abilities and how he directed, and it was wow, I really looked up to this guy, And then I even think of our dad. I know that's a whole other topic, but, Dad did a lot when we used to help him with summer theater. Doing the shows and the sets for the shows and stuff like that. And so Dad was you do this, and I just remember I saw myself as a follower for a longest time too. And maybe because we've talked about this dynamic, I know, individually, but we had almost two families, even though we had 6 kids. There was the older family and there was a younger family. and I was the youngest of the older family, and you're the youngest of all of us, but the younger of the younger family. So
Yeah.
I think maybe naturally both of us just fell into that fellowship role,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, that's a good point. And like you said, I think for me too, it was, it was definitely some teachers along the way that just you really connect with, and they're connecting with you. And I think that's an easy way to say, like, oh, they're a good leader because I'm following from them, I'm learning from them, and you kind of picked up on that, but didn't always recognize that. I think again, playing sports is when I started to recognize a little bit more of that, where it was like certain players on the team. If it wasn't the coach at that time, they're wanting us to kind of see from each other. And there was definitely some that were natural leaders and were good at it. And there was others that tried to be leaders and were really bad at it. And you could definitely see the difference there. And I think that's probably about the time frame, maybe in high school at that point. Finally, I was starting to recognize, like, oh, wait a minute. So this guy's a leader. We're following him and he's taking us in the right direction. This one thinks he's a leader, but he's really bad at it. And I think that's what started to differentiate for me at a younger age, was noticing that. So how about for you? Like,
Okay.
you kind of talked about the first person. What impact did that have on you when you started to recognize that first person or first people that were becoming the leader to you?
I, I think same thing. I think by God's grace, I think we escaped. I know I did escape not following some of the wrong leaders.
Mm.
I remember because we had our childhood friend, our friend and Carl Carmen lived next door, and we should invite him on the podcast one of these days. But he could have got us into a lot of trouble. And it's funny when our kids, because I used to talk about Carl to our kids all the time, and at our dad's funeral, I remember Carl came in, to pay his respects, and our kids goes, "Oh, is this the infamous Carl?" It's like, yes, this is Carl. But Carl really could have. I mean, he got into a lot of stuff, and for some reason, we were still his friend, and he still like looked, I think, up to us as friends, but yet we never followed him totally in all the stuff that he was
Mm.
doing. So, yeah, I think somewhere along the line, you realized there was a, and I don't know if we would have called it that as kids or even teenagers, but there's an ethical, moral barrier that you don't want to cross
Mm.
because they were leading you in that path. And it was like, no, I don't want to go there because that's probably not a good thing to do. And of course, I was always afraid of getting caught. That was my biggest trouble
Yeah, I
too.
was very similar to
So I
that.
have this, um, yeah, crazy stuff, right?
Yeah.
So, what kind of impact do you think some of them had on you? And even now, when you think of leadership today, like, did they ingrain some things into you?
Yeah, I think again, I think when I started to recognize what it was made a bigger impact. So I remember doing
Okay.
a men's small group study in well, probably I guess in my mid 20s maybe, and we went through a leadership book by John Maxwell. He's one of my favorite guys to listen to. And I remember going through his book, and I was like, wow, this is kind of crazy. Like all these different laws of how to be a leader and what a leader looks like, and I mean, that's where it really opened my eyes to understand, like, okay, this is leadership. And I think probably when I started getting in the working world is probably where you start to recognize that a little bit too, because different managers, different bosses, from part-time retail jobs to, some other jobs I had leading up to college was, you can see obviously your boss was a leader, whether they were good or bad, they were a leader. And you had to follow them and you had to do what they were telling you to do. And I think that's where probably the biggest impact came to me, was that. And I think it was an interesting journey because even, as a high school kid working in retail, you had several, shift managers and assistant managers and managers, depending on who was on your shift that day. And they all were different. And some of them you really liked, and some of them you really didn't like. And some of them you really liked because they were kind of chill and didn't do much, and yet they were still the leader. So, and then others were like, okay, they're kind of not that nice anymore, and I don't really enjoy working with them, but you knew they actually got the job done and did what they were supposed to do. So it was like, wait a minute. So which am I supposed to follow then? Like, I kind of like hanging with this guy because he's kind of fun to be around, but we're not getting as much done as this one who's really just, all business and we're getting the work done. So I think that's what kind of became ingrained in me then, to figure out like, okay, so you kind of have to take different characteristics of what an actual good leader is versus a bad leader versus somebody who thinks they're a leader. So that's where I think it became a little bit more obvious to me at that time. How about you? When did you kind of notice some of those differences in your leadership or your following journey
When
to
did I
understand
notice it?
leadership?
Probably, like I said, with with our neighbor here, that certain people were leaders, but they could get you in trouble, and the leaders
Mm,
are leaders that you wanted to admire. And I go back to some of the teachers, like my perfectionist mode. I don't think just came from our dad, but I think it came
yeah,
from watching someone like the music director Richard. It was like, no, you could do better, and it was that whole thing of not that you're bad,
yeah,
but you could do this better, and it was that
yeah,
drive to perfection. And
yeah.
perfection, a lot of people get steered away from perfection because they're like, oh, I'll never be perfect. It's like, no, you won't. That's the idea. It's that
Right, right.
strive towards something
Yeah,
that I can do this better next time. And yeah, I did it. And you can, I think one of the beautiful things about that is you can critique yourself and say, okay, this is where I could improve, but you don't put yourself down in that process.
right.
You're actually trying to build yourself up to say, look, yeah, but you could fix this.
Mhm.
And I think that's helped me a lot on the other side of this now, seeing myself as a leader.
Right, right. So
If
what
if
would
you
you
could if you if you
okay.
could I say if you could define leadership in like a simple word or phrase, what would you how would you define leadership?
Well, again, I would have to honestly go back to John Maxwell. I think one of his best quotes on leadership is probably one of my favorite ones is leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. And I think it's such a
Okay.
simplified way of putting it. And I love that because that I think really helped me understand truly what that is. We all have influence on people. Like you said, good or bad, you're getting influenced.
Yeah.
And it's your decision whether you're going to follow that bad influence or the good influence and how you want that to change or shape your life and what you're doing with that. So I think for understanding like that's what leadership is, I think what it helped me understand too was there's different aspects in my life that I guess, I was in leadership roles. Sometimes I didn't recognize, like, oh, I guess maybe I am a leader in this. And then other times I obviously knew based on the position I had, like, okay, I know I'm in charge of this or that or in charge of certain people. And I think sometimes throughout my, personal and work career, it started to make sense to me that I didn't always feel like I had a lot of people to lead, but then started to recognize, like, well, wait a minute, if all leadership is influence, then how much influence do I have on the people I am around every single day, whether it's at home or at work or at church or other aspects, coaching, all these different things that I've been a part of. So that's where that became so real to me. So I think to me, that's like one of the best things. I can kind of go into that a little bit more a little bit later, but that to me was like one of the best quotes that I've heard as far as defining what leadership is because it's so simplified. So how about you? What do you think are good key characteristics of leadership?
I like that word influence. I think that's great.
Mm.
I love the phrase, if you think you're a leader and you look behind you, nobody's following you, you're not a leader
Yeah.
because you're not influencing people. You know,
Right.
it's that simple. You're not influencing. And sometimes we can have greater leadership and other times we can't. When I think of leadership and you said it, we all lead at times,
Mm.
whether we realize that or not, we're leading. And I know some of the things I look for because again, things been a part of, you look for people who are leaders as a leader because you want to expand whatever you're trying to do, whatever that is, right? And so when I look for someone, there's two characteristics I always look for, and that's teachability
Mm.
or servanthood. Are they willing to serve? And for me, teachability is so huge because even if I get into conversation, I got in a conversation with this guy yesterday and met, and we were chatting a little bit, and just in simple conversation, I walked away from that thing like, this guy's not even teachable.
Mm.
Like he
Yeah, you
just
can
he
recognize it
knows everything
quickly.
about
Yeah.
everything, and
Mm.
yeah, and so like, what, we could be friends or whatever, go have a cup of coffee, but it's like I don't even know what I talk about because there's not even a willingness to listen a little to say, oh, I never thought of it that way, or I never. and we need that. We all need that. But so I look for that. I look for the teachability. Is this person able to learn before they're able? Because unless you're unless you're willing to learn and follow, you can't lead.
Yeah, good
And
point.
I don't think some people realize that, right? They
Mhm.
they they want to be leaders. Oh, if you just put me in charge of this, like I can manage this. It's like even if you haven't learned to follow someone, you're going to be a terrible leader because you're going to think it's top down instead of
Right.
getting under and serving.
Yeah.
And tying into that when with our kids, I always told them look for when they're looking for the future spouse, it was always look for the person who serves. Look for the
Yeah.
one who naturally gets up and serves. And I remember getting a call from our daughter when she was telling us about her boyfriend. And one of her first things was, and dad, he serves, you know.
She got the
And
message.
it was like, look around the room. She got the message. It was like, look around the room. If at the end of the party, is he the one going around and helping clean up? Does he
Mhm.
naturally just gravitate towards that? Because if they don't, you're not going to teach it to them, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And that happens to be our son-in-law now. So that's pretty cool. But
Yeah, I think,
so how
you
about you?
touched
Like, I
on.
mean, what are some characteristics?
Well, I think, yeah, you touched on the highest one. I think is honestly, once I understood that, and again, that was coming through some of the Maxwell stuff and some other people that I, was speaking to around that time, understanding this whole concept of servant leadership and under like, what is that? That doesn't make sense. Like I always thought the leader is on top, and you have all your people underneath you work, and then to totally flip everything around and understand that idea of the servant has to lead, the leader has to
Yeah.
serve. That's such a different concept because I think in so many worlds, whether it's business, whether it's school, whether it's sports, whatever it is, whatever industry it is, so many people I think will point to successful businesses, successful organizations, successful teams, successful ministries, whatever it is, based on the leadership and whether that leader is a servant leader or not. So to understand, I think, the great concept, I think, is again, that idea of, the CEO that worked their way up through the ladder. They didn't just, graduate, get a quick job to be the CEO and has no idea what all those other departments down below them even do versus the person who goes in and worked those different jobs or understood those different departments. So they understand how the whole entire company works and nothing's beneath them. So that whole concept to me was very foreign, but then once I hit that, it helped me to understand, like, wow, this is really different than what I thought leadership was. So even my experience growing up, whether again it was teachers,
Mhm.
coaches, whoever else I was following, some of them I think that I was more drawn to, I think did have that quality. I just didn't recognize as that's what it was, that they were a servant leader. And I think that's such a cool thing to gravitate to. It's easy to gravitate to when, like you said, if you see that person that's, constantly serving, but they're like, wait a minute, that's the guy in charge, or that's the lady in charge of all this stuff, but they're out there serving and they're doing, all the grunt stuff. Like that's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
So I've tried to,
Yeah.
use that myself in any aspects that I've been part of leadership is I've tried really hard to never look down and say, oh, well, that job is beneath me, or now that I've gotten here, that's beneath me. And I think for me, the great experience I had was when I was going through college and grad school for PT. I was working at the same place that I went back to work at after I graduated. So I had been there quite a few years and I was there as an aide. Well, my job as an aide was basically just to help out wherever I was needed. And I was fine with that. That was my job. I did a good job of helping out wherever I was needed. And then when I graduated now I'm kind of above that level now that I'm now the therapist and I have the aides, helping me. But I was always trying to be very conscious of not, treating them that way and say, well, I'm up here and you're down there. I was there, so I know what that job was like and I worked that job a lot. So being able to understand that helped me a lot to be able to communicate with the people I worked with, and at times was leading some of those staff, and just to understand the different aspects of the department too and how it ran. Just it was so much more helpful to me. So I'm glad I had that experience and
Yeah.
gained that knowledge because that helped me a lot.
Yeah. So at what point do you think, I mean, we've talked about some of the characteristics that we liked, but at what point did it occur to you that, wow, I am a leader?
Um, I think, it was a lot of stuff happened around the same time, for me personally. So I had graduated school, gotten married, and the job I was working at, I really didn't have any leadership role there. I was still kind of getting through school at the time. Um, at our church, I was involved in different ministries there that I de- started developing leadership roles there, but again, kind of never really considered myself a leader, even though I was in a position where, yes, I was kind of calling the shots on certain things. And I think it still took me a little while around that time to start understanding, okay, well, wait a minute, am I leading anybody really? I'm not sure. And then after we started having kids and my job at my work had changed a little bit, and I had done a different role there, and I was now actually leading some people, but still not quite understanding that. Oh, wait, I am trying to help them and influence them, and I technically, by a work standard, I had authority over some of the things that they were doing as an oversight kind of thing. But still never recognized myself as like, well, I'm not, the top dog in the department or anything. I'm not the director. I'm not, I'm not an official leadership role or title. So I guess I never looked at it that way. So I always was kind of looking at the titles, and that's kind of how I was looking at things. Is like, well, if I don't have that title, I'm not really any different than you. I'm not leading you. I'm the same. We're all on the same level. And I think what I started to recognize when I got some feedback from different coworkers and staff and stuff was that I was actually leading them at times and not realizing or recognizing that I had a leadership role, because it was more just how I worked and my work ethic that changed their mindset of me, that I was actually more of an influence on them. So that's where it started to make a little sense, but I still kept looking for the title. And then a few years after that, I think I started to recognize and realize that we're all leaders, because we all have a role to play. That again goes back to that simple thing that we all influence. So then when I looked at that, I thought, well, wait a minute. I have a house, a wife, a couple kids at that point. Like, I'm leader of my family. Like, I'm helping lead them. I mean,
Yeah.
there's certain roles, but like I'm leading my family. So now I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I am a leader because I have a family that I'm leading. And then that kind of spilled over into some other, work titles and stuff that made sense. So it's been kind of an interesting journey for me personally, because again, there's not always been this huge, amount of people that I've been leading. So it's been like little different things along the way that I've led. Um, so I'll pause there and jump in and ask you the same question. When did you feel like you had your first leadership role, or when did it become, recognizable to you?
Wow. Well, you mentioned parenthood, and we'll have to talk a whole nother
Yeah.
subject on, dad and all that kind of stuff. But I remember, here was, we had started attending a new church, and we started attending this church called Bible Fellowship that, we both ended up going for a while. And we came to service, but we didn't come to Sunday school. And that was part of the program of that church. That's how they operated. And I remember talking to an older gentleman, and his name was Harmon Johnson. And I know you know Harmon and Joanne. They
Yeah.
they were they were great influence. Talk about leaders in your life. They were a couple that were leaders
Yeah.
in our lives that I didn't realize till much later how much influence they had. But I remember Harmon saying to me one time, I said, he's like, you don't have to come to Sunday school. He says, that's up to you. He said, but you lead your home. And I was
Mm.
like, what? He said, if you want your family to be a part of this and that extra hour on a Sunday morning, then that's your choice as the father to lead your family in that direction. And that was powerful to me, to be like, whoa, whether we go to church on Sunday or not is my
Yeah.
role, not someone else's. That's, and so that was big. But I think, in terms of when I saw my leadership role, well, and there's so many stories that revolve around this. I never saw myself as a leader at all. And for the longest
Mm.
time. And I remember as a kid helping dad. And it was like, okay, what do you need? Hammer. Okay, go get the screwdriver. And so I never saw myself in that role of, I'm the one leading this. And it's funny because even when I can easily slip back into the servant role, like that doesn't phase me. So
Mm.
recently, my brother and I, brother Barry, did a project. We were working on putting in a window, and I just easily now. I was going to do it. It was my project actually, but Barry knew a lot more. So I naturally just slid back into, go ahead, tell me what to do. And I'll just follow,
Yeah.
And so that was just always my MO, And then I remember getting involved in some ministry things, and I still saw it like I'm not the leader. Like I don't stand up in front of a room. I don't like standing in front of people and talking. Back then, that's where I was, and little by little, here we were leading a ministry that kept growing, and we started a young adults group, not once but twice, 3 times in different churches, and I still didn't see myself as a leader. Like I just didn't see that role. And then even when I went into the ministry here as a pastor, I remember still seeing myself as I'm just an associate role. I just play I'll be the
Mhm.
children's pastor. I'll do whatever. And that's just my role. And when it really hit me was, and maybe because it was the people around me that I just didn't, maybe there weren't strong leaders that saw the leadership gift. And so they just didn't focus there. Where it was when I went for a job interview for children's pastor that and it was interesting because it was my homiletics professor who was the senior pastor of the church, and they interviewed me. There's like 5, 6 people in a room, and I thought, oh, this is ideal because I've been doing kids ministries like 15 years. This will be a neat role. This will be great because I'm really good at this, and I don't lead the ship. I just do this little thing on the side. And not that it wasn't a big children's ministry, but I remember meeting with him we went out for lunch or coffee or something after a couple weeks after the job interview, and he was the one who impacted me because he said, I said, first of all, you didn't get the job. And I'm like, oh man, that stings because I really was looking for a full-time job at that point. But he said, I want you to tell you that unanimously, we all see the gift of leadership in you by just how you carried yourself and what you said and what you've accomplished. We think you should take a lead role as a pastor. And that was the first time that someone ever directly challenged me that you can do this in a leadership role. And so that was really the turning point for me.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think, I think it's a really interesting point because I know for me personally, it's the same thing. It's like, unless somebody recognized to say like, hey, you can lead this, I don't think I have the confidence to say, oh, I'm a leader, I'm going to jump in there. My personality is not just that, brash to just say I'm in charge. And I know when you're around
Yeah,
different
me neither.
groups, different people, there's always somebody that's just like, I'm in charge, I'm taking the lead. And then a lot of times, again, you sit back and
Yeah.
you're watching, you're thinking like, I know they are in charge, but they're not very good at it. And everybody else can recognize that they're not very good
Yeah.
at it.
Yeah.
And it's like things like that starts to
But
make you
nobody else
wonder,
says
like,
anything.
okay, right, nobody wants to say anything because they're just like, oh, I'm not saying it, but we all think the same thing. Like that person should not be in
Yep.
charge. And then what I've recognized in my experience is like the more you start questioning a little bit, the more you start asking, all of a sudden people start looking at you and they're like, well, wait a minute, why don't you take this over then? And, a lot of times when that's
Yeah.
happened to me in my life, sometimes it's almost like, well, I don't know if I really want the responsibility or I don't know if I want the commitment but I have to always sit back and think like, wait a minute, if they're recognizing something in me, I guess I should recognize that myself and understand that maybe there is a leadership quality in there or they're seeing something in me that I'm not seeing. And I think so often we miss that.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder like
Yeah.
how many people miss that. I remember one time years ago, again, it was ministry in church and I remember the pastor at the time told me flat out, he's like, you're the guy. I'm like, no, I'm not the guy. He's like, no, you're the guy. I'm like, no, I'm not the guy. And then years later, I looked back and I thought, you know what? Maybe I should have listened to him. Maybe I was the guy for that role at that time to
The
lead in
guy.
that way. I
Yeah.
didn't think I was. So I think it's
Yeah.
interesting too how you
And
talked about recognizing the qualities or lack of qualities in the other leaders around you, and either wanting to do it differently and jumping in to lead because you think you can really do a much better job, or having somebody else recognize that trait in you to see that.
yeah. I think that there's 2 characteristics that need to come out from that. One is the humility in leadership,
Mm,
that it's the reluctant leader. And I think the reluctant leaders, I found this more often than not, the reluctant leader is the better leader because they're
that's a
not
good
the one
point.
that
Yeah,
jumps up first. They're not the one
yeah,
who is like they stay back and they're like, and then somebody recognizes, say, listen, I want you to lead this. And I'm like, really don't want to, but
Yeah.
okay, and then they, they're gifted and they can do it. The other thing I think is encouragement, not just to you and me, but I hope everybody listening out there is, if you even have an inkling towards leadership gifts at all, and as you said, we all lead in some aspect, but to encourage others to lead,
Mm.
to give them a little bit of a responsibility, something where it's like, well, this is yours. You make the choice, and what do you think? And it builds all of us up when we
Mm.
do that, because they see themselves a little bit better in whatever that is. And now they're taking on more responsibility in whatever that is. And that's huge, because now any organization, any company will now be better because that person has done a little bit more in a leadership role,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think,
So
oh, go ahead. Go
what
ahead.
for? No, go on, finish up.
So I was going to say, I think again, like recognizing when you may have those leadership qualities, but are scared to use them, or when you just feel drawn to want to get involved in something and you keep holding back. I think that's a good indicator that that is your turn to step up. And like you said, like giving people just the encouragement to say, hey, you can handle this and I want you to run with it. And it's such a simple thing to tell them that. And in their mind, they might just be thinking, oh, they want me to just work on this little project and told me to run with it and I can kind of be creative or whatever. And then what you're actually doing, though, is helping them recognize that, like, I'm giving you ability to be a leader. Because now if you do this project on your own and you have the autonomy to do that, because I believe in you to do that, now you're building them up to the next level for them to recognize their own potential there. And I think that's such a key element too. So I think as we're wrapping up this episode, what I would encourage all of you to do is, I think we all fail as leaders. And again, another great John Maxwell book was Failing Forward. The whole idea of, if we're going to fail, we're going to fail
Yeah.
forward so we can get up and we can do better at it. We all do that, in so many different ways. And again, we've touched on a lot of different avenues of where we possibly do lead, and may not even recognize it. So again, if leadership truly is influence and nothing more, nothing less, then I think we need to recognize that when we do fail as leaders, and we all will at some extent, we all will fail as leaders, because again, none of us are perfect. But to understand what, the aspects of leadership is, understanding the importance of servant leadership rather than trying to get a title to be overseeing people, but working with and working for people and doing things for your people that you're leading is so important. But we know that we all will make mistakes at that. And, again, like you mentioned, Kenny, the humility, we've got to pick ourselves up. We've got to recognize that we made the mistake. We've got to own that mistake, be accountable to it. And then we have to make that change, and we can all make that change. So that's the things we want to encourage you all listening today, is that if you've been in a leadership role and you've messed up, it's okay. It's all right. Pick up your bootstraps and get back up again and try it again. If you've been led by a poor leader, this is your chance to shine and step up and say, hey, I think we can do this a different way. And don't be afraid to share things. So those of you that have failed at leadership or failed at following, then, take that mulligan and try again, because you can all succeed.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, why don't we share quickly, do you know a mulligan, or does a mulligan come to mind for you when you failed in leadership?
Oof, that's a good question. I can't think of any major ones off the top of my head. I mean, I think, probably more little things that happen along the way, but also recognizing that, wait a minute, if I'm in charge of this, if I'm leading this thing and this is mine and I made that mistake, then I'm the one that has to own up to that. And I have had things like that happen in the past. I probably the most thing that would come to mind, again, I don't know if it's a specific incident that happened, but I know it happened occasionally, was I was running a wheelchair seating clinic at a rehab center I was working at for many, many years. And there was a lot of nuances to it. I led the clinic. I, led the whole thing as far as working with vendors and the patients and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of moving parts. And the problem is all of it fell back on me, or I took the ownership of it, that if the vendor messed up, or if something else fell apart along the way during that whole process, and it's unfortunately a very lengthy process, I'm the one that had to step up and say, okay, I didn't follow up, and had to call the patient, tell the patient I didn't do my job well enough. I didn't call the vendor
Okay.
quick enough. A lot of times it wasn't always my fault, but I would always try to go back to the patient and say, listen, this is where it messed up, and that's on me. So we're going to try again, or we're going to try to, do better at this to get this thing moving. That's probably like one of the bigger examples I could think of off the top of my head. But I'll throw that question back at you then.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question for me too. I got a ton of them, but probably the biggest mulligan I ever took was in terms of leadership was so I didn't get that role as a children's pastor. So I got connected to a church, and this is like another lifetime ago, but I got connected to a church that were looking for a lead pastor. It was a church about 150 so people, and they were convinced they wanted to turn around the church. They were tired of all the trouble going on in the church, and they just really wanted to reach the community. And so I was like, okay, I'm your guy. If you want to make changes, I'm your guy. But if I come here, I mean, I remember giving the message to try to convince them to hire me was basically, don't hire me unless you want to make a lot of radical changes, because that's what I'm going to do, right? And so anyway, I took the job in the church, and we moved there, moved the family, and it was a bad church. I mean, it really was. I mean, not that there weren't some really good people there, but very, very troubled. Everything you've ever read about a church that's bad was wrapped up in that church in one. And after 4.5 years, they fired me on the spot. Like, actually, they fired both of us because Julie my wife was playing the secretary at that point. She was playing that, that role. And wow, here it was. I don't know how old I was, some 30 something or whatever at the time. Like, I've never lost a job in my life. Like, I've never been fired. I didn't lose a paper route. I didn't lose a job at, the convenience store I was working. I never lost a job. Nobody's ever fired me. Like, it was very, very like devastating, And I know we could talk about a whole topic on these some other time, but so that was a huge failure. That was like, oh my goodness, and wow, now what, And
Yeah.
but it was through a lot of circumstances where the mulligan I took was start our own church. So we literally, that led to a series of events that catalyst to start a church that was really cool. I mean, it was a great experience and all that kind of stuff for a number of years. But so that was the mulligan, swung again, and and God really used that in a lot of ways. And again, that seems like a lifetime ago, but yeah. So I'm a big fan of, like you had said with John Maxwell, about falling forward. Don't, it is so easy to want to give up when you fail. And it's easy to blame everything. And believe me, I blamed a lot of things in those things too. And believe me, there's a lot of circumstances, but the bottom line is it still comes back to you. Are you going to fall forward regardless of what it was, and take the next step in your life? Because you grow through it, And successful people are successful not because they're lucky, but because they do a lot of things and fail at a lot of things until they get to where they're at. And that's what makes them successful, especially when it comes to leadership,
Yeah.
So if you're out there, I just really encourage you to see yourself as a leader first. And I know Brian has hit on that a few times, but see that, you really do influence people, and take that responsibility of that influence, and use it wisely. And so go at it again, and take up whatever you need to do, and start leading people in the right direction.
We know everyone can use a second chance or a do-over. So take a mulligan and try again. Thanks so much for joining with us today. Make sure you follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. Like, click, and subscribe.